Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. We are at the point of Birgit's keynote now, the thing that we've been looking forward to. Before I invite Zizek to introduce Birgit, I'd like to remind us all that we'll have a short, like 10 to 15 minutes conversation at the very end about the way forward. So I'd like to press on at least those who are interested in thinking with us about the way forward, about publication or whatever it is that we want to do later on. I'd like to invite you to join us after the keynote to discuss what we can do together. Having said that, I'm going to invite Zizek to introduce our speaker, and that will be followed by, of course, disturbing heritage. Zizek, go ahead.
It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Birgit Meyer, Professor of Religious Studies at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Trained as a cultural anthropologist, Professor Meyer has been extensively contributing to the multiple research fields. Her early publications focuses on modernity and conversion, the rise of Pentecostalism in the context of neoliberal capitalism. She played key roles in shaping the research fields such as material culture and lived religion. Pushing forward a new agenda for religious studies that is liberated from the unproductive religious studies theology binary, she suggests placing religious studies in the midst of humanities with a transnational and pluralistic outlook. Professor Meyer is currently directing the research program called Religious Matters in an Entangled World. She is a founding editor of Material Religion, an interdisciplinary journal that publishes critical reflections on materialization of religions. In addition, she is the editor of a series entitled Material Mediations, People and Things in a World of Movement, published by Berkan Independent Publishing House. Her work on heritage in Europe and Africa calls attention to various facets of the relation between heritage and the sacred, and takes seriously the aesthetic regimes of representation. Her keynote lecture for today is entitled Disturbing Heritage. Thank you so much again for joining us, and the mic is yours.
Oh, thank you very much for this nice introduction. And also thank you to celebrate with Zizek and Annika for organizing such a cutting edge conference, also allowing for so many wonderfully insightful papers that were presented, which then triggered such intriguing discussions. I was really quite amazed also to see in the chat how people commented that what they heard made them think, that it changed their understanding and all that. I think you barely experienced this open admission of that there's so much to be learned from this mutual engagement in a face-to-face setting. So I saw this with great pleasure, and I can only agree that there's so much already that I learned that opened my horizon, which unfortunately I could not all work into this keynote again. I also thank you for still being around. It's late in Amsterdam, the sun is shining at long last, and I guess that everyone longs also for a closure, to have some drinks or go for dinner or whatever, but well, here we go. So the past is present through its lasting material forms in open and hidden ways, marked and unmarked. Whether cherished, taken for granted, or dismissed and left to decay, things from the past are subject to contested and conflicting political aesthetic significations and frames. We are in the midst of societal debates about the suitability of certain things to anchor cultural memory and their commemorative value. Exactly for this reason, things are such an excellent entry point into broader matters of conflict with regard to coexistence in plural religious environments, or with regard to the haunting presence of the colonial past, fascism, Chernobyl, and other outrageous spaces and events about which we also heard during this workshop. While heritage connotes an appreciative stance towards such things and recognizes their cultural value, for better or worse, in being kept in museums or as monuments, waste, as we saw, is in many respects the other of heritage. Things that lost their value, left to decay, yet can be scrutinized for alternative understandings of how past things matter in our global entangled world, as haunting shadows, shady specters, or hidden time bombs, challenging how histories have been written and the narratives and powers condoned by them. At the same time, both heritage and waste are categories that can be mobilized with regard to the same things. Waste may become heritage and vice versa. In many ways, heritage has run out of control, politically, but also as a concept. Heritage forms are found to be disturbing. For instance, once built for purposes of cultural memory for the privileged and powerful, statues of the likes of Cecil Rhodes, General Lee, VOC Governor Peterson Kuhn, or Hans Sloane evoke repulsion and protest on the part of those whose ancestors were on the suffering, long muted side of the activities to which these men owed the appreciation expressed through these statues that were often erected a long time ago. Their statues must go, not so as to forget the past that these men were responsible to shape, but to remember that their deeds do not deserve a positive commemoration. Calling attention to the breaking rather than making of heritage, such things call for a study of heritage from the angle of disturbance. And this is also the main concern of this workshop, which does not only call attention to disturbing heritage, but above all seeks to disturb heritage as a category and regime employed to authenticate certain things from the past as worth preserving. I very much appreciate the call to question the boundaries of what counts as heritage by bringing into the picture undesirables as spirits, energies, and waste. These undesirables may be excluded from heritage as we know it, as a secular domain separate from religion on the one hand and from waste on the other. Yet their very exclusion shapes what heritage is taken to be, and hence must be a central concern for scholarly work. Clarity always comes by starting with the mess, by opening up to the spaces in between the clear-cut boundaries, and things are an apt starting point to do so. And so with this lecture, I happily partake in widening the conceptual scope with regard to the study of the power of and conflicts about lasting material forms that cannot be fully captured by remaining within, and I quote, the place-oriented static and secularized notions that abound in debates about heritage. Based on my research on the rise of Christianity in Ghana and the decline of Christianity in the Netherlands, I want to take a focus on discarded things, waste as starting point. In Ghana, the rise and spread of Christianity in colonial times implied the framing of objects central to indigenous and religious traditions as fetishes and idols that were to be discarded, destroyed, or taken to ethnographic museums where they are still kept. In the Netherlands, where de-churching nowadays occurs on a massive scale, Christian things are abandoned and show up in many unexpected, mundane places. The disintegration of indigenous religiosity in Ghana and Christianity in the Netherlands involves that things hitherto vested with sacrality are on the move, potentially up for being reframed and claimed as heritage. Circling around heritage from its margins, in this presentation, I will first focus on waste and secondly on heritage and religion. Tracing the trajectory of certain things from the domain of religion to waste to heritage, I seek to attend to heritage as a category that may contain certain valuable things from the past in a secular frame. At the center of my analysis is the afterlife of objects and images once they fall out of the religious regime in which they functioned and come to appear as matter out of time and place, vis-a-vis which people may feel at a loss or even take offense. African objects and sculptures are not easily put on the same plane as Christian objects and sculptures, neither in public debates nor in scholarship. And for me too, my research in Africa and my life in Europe often seemed worlds apart, but not any longer. African objects, as those I just showed, have been targeted in iconoclasms in the course of colonization and evangelization, whereas the crucifixes I showed became superfluous in the course of increasing de-churching. But they share a significant feature. They have become waste, at least for some time. As laid out by William Viney, waste is a notion employed to signal the end of the use time of a thing, which gave it a role for the future. If Mary Douglas' notion of matter out of place regards dirt as a byproduct of classification that disturbs a certain order, Viney's idea about waste is that it is a matter out of time. We make waste by removing a thing from use or removing use from a thing. But in both cases, the time of the object becomes divided into a time of use and a time of waste. Qualifying an object as waste means that it has no use and future any longer. Discarded objects enshrine a past temporality, indexing a past that has ended and yet is present and potentially out of control. History and heritage, as main cultural political forms to contain and remember the past, do not exhaust or contain the past. Hence the need to think about waste as a category employed in the making of time. Containing what is discarded and of no use, waste can also serve as an entry point into the politics that define what is valuable and useful, of what matters and what not. Looked at from this angle, the study of waste makes us aware of the temporality of things and alerts us to the shift undergone by things from a matter in time and in place to one out of time and out of place, and the narratives that go with it. But there is even more, as these things once were operative in a religious setting, as harbingers of spirit power in the African case, or as devotional objects in the Christian one. Irene Stengs coined the felicitous notion of sacred waste, and here you see the reference, so as to refer to certain things that were loaded with diffuse power through a process of sacralization and therefore cannot be disposed smoothly, but require special treatment and evoke a sense of unease. Religious traditions have all sorts of ways of dealing with sacred waste via practices of cleansing and exit rites. What interests me here, however, is not how sacred waste is dealt with within a religious tradition, as for example, Catholicism, but how it is dealt with when a religious tradition goes down and its things fall apart in the secular domain, perhaps being refashioned ultimately as a new secular sacred. Religious things that become waste still carry what Dan Bakers called sacred residue, which makes them ambiguous and prone to pollution, certainly when placed in settings that differ strongly from those of their previous religious use. For the things that stand central in this lecture, their status as discarded matter or waste was not the end point in their trajectory, as they did not end up and disintegrate on the garbage heap of history. They were eligible for a new status, use, and future as heritage. Heritage, in other words, is a container category that absorbs sacred waste, or more politely, religious heritage. But what is religious heritage? Or better still, what is religious about heritage? And whose heritage is it? The category religious heritage that is coming up prominently, especially, but not only in the Netherlands, in the aftermath of far-reaching de-churching, testifies to the enduring relevance of religion on multiple levels to the formation of heritage in our time. Given that heritage operates in a regime, and here I refer to the work of Regina Bendix, for example, so a regime of explicit and implicit secular rules and regulations implemented by monument boards, heritage institutions, and museums, the question arises what the attribute religious does to heritage, and conversely, what the noun heritage does to the religious things it sets out to preserve. What happens when religious things are transferred from a religious to a secular regime? How religious is religious heritage? How secular does religious heritage become in the process of its heritageization? I address the questions arising around religious heritage from a material approach that takes things as intrinsic and constitutive aspects of both religion and heritage. This approach enables us to analyze religion and heritage not simply as abstract categories, but as actual institutionalized regimes that work with the same material forms, yet according to the ways of their respective institutions and logics. From this angle, it is possible to explore in detail how particular things that are valued and handled in both regimes, as well as to trace the implications of their transition from one regime to the other, be it a Renaissance statue of Mary that moves from church to museum, or an Nkisi figure taken from the mission field in Africa into an ethnographic collection, as in the exhibition Unvergleichlich in the Bode Museum from Berlin from 2017 to 19. How does such a transition affect what Benjamin called the cult value of a religious object that is put on display for, quote, unquote, its exhibition value? As it's also a question that arises from Zizek's paper about Mevlana's, about Rumi's tomb. To what extent does the heritage regime into which religious objects are transposed neutralize their religious value and power? In other words, how resilient is the religious dimension enshrined in the cult value in the frame of heritage? While I find it illuminating to distinguish between religion and heritage as regimes that value and handle the very things differently, my aim is not to insist on their separateness, but to explore how they fold into and possibly mess up each other. Throughout time and across the globe, religious traditions begin, transform, dissipate, and eventually end. Their material remains become waste and perhaps become recognized as heritage along the way or as a second career. European museums are filled with the sacred things of extinct religions from, for instance, ancient Egypt, Greece, or the Roman Empire. Long taken to represent the cradle of the Occident, they are now claimed alongside sites such as Machu Picchu or Angkor Wat as instances of the universal heritage of humankind. Museums also display Christian statues and images that came to be valued as high art, yet originated before the era of art, as Hans Belting put it, when art and religion were not separated in the way as is the case in our time. Moreover, museums display objects and figures from indigenous religious traditions that were appropriated through looting, trade, or missionary work during the colonization of the global South. Mission societies in particular were keen to assemble what they perceived as fetishes and idols so as to document the triumphant superiority of Christianity over heathendom. While the term religious heritage may apply to all these instances, in Europe, it gained prominence in relation to the current rather dramatic process of decline of Christianity as a lived religion and its rise as a resource for heritage formation. Culturalized Christianity as heritage, as it is often claimed, also by right-wing identitarian movements. In the sites of origin of the things labeled as idols and fetishes, the status of these things is often up for debate as to whether and how to accommodate the material culture of traditional religion as art or heritage, as pointed out by Mariam yesterday. In the following, I will focus on the material implications of secularization and unchurching in the contemporary Netherlands and of conversion to Christianity in Ghana in the late 19th and early 20th century, implying the production of different sorts of religious waste and its reframing as some kind of contested heritage. Currently, there is a great deal of Christian waste, defunct buildings, crucifixes, which you saw already, monstrances, reliquaries, and images of Mary, Jesus, and saints who lost their original users. And some of it is reframed as religious heritage. And the Dutch Rijksdienst for Cultural Heritage plays a very important role. It's a state institution to organize this material stuff. So, and this is really an urgent issue because in the Netherlands, 1 out of 4 church buildings already has received a new function. Also cities like Utrecht city engages in dealing with religious heritage. The attribute religious here, of course, refers to their past rather than their present use. And in the same vein, the current claims laid to Europe's Christian or even Judeo-Christian heritage and the concomitant heritagization of Christianity do not require active belief and participation in the Christian church and involve de facto a shift of ownership. The point is that things qualified as religious heritage fall into the domain of secular heritage, with its own custodians, logic, and regimes for preservation and display, something Marian Burchardt also worked on in his latest book, in which he focuses on Canada and Spain. Exactly for this reason, the state and other secular instances can invest in its upkeep without trespassing the proverbial separation of church and state in a way that would be more difficult to implement if the material forms would still be part of the regime of a church. Employing heritage as a secular frame allows to bestow value on churches and other Christian things as relevant to society, even though the churches themselves are shrinking and people are losing their faith. In the same vein, museums are not bound to treat items from the Christian past in a religious manner, even though they may opt to show some courtesy, just as the reuse of former churches by new secular owners is sought to occur in a respectful, befitting manner, so as to respect the religious history of the building and the sentiments it still evokes. The idea is that Christian sacred buildings and things may be deconsecrated, but not to be desecrated. As part of a secular heritage regime, heritage institutions and museums have the possibility to engage with formerly Christian things in their own manner. They can take even the risk to trigger a sense of offense in Christian visitors or even charges of blasphemy, as was the case with the exhibition Verspijkerd en Verzaagd in Dutch, Recycling Jesus, in English, in the Noord-Brabants Museum, that displayed all sorts of artworks made of discharged and defunct Christian material forms. Such playful work with the sacred waste that is left behind as material reminders of the sobering of Catholicism in the aftermath of Vaticanum II and the steady decline of Christianity spotlights the extent to which religious heritage has been severed from its Christian roots and thus became effectively secularized. The statement of museum director Charles de Moy is telling: Christian heritage retained in another way than we are usually inclined to think. And indeed, as the guest book to the exhibition shows, beholders may feel offended because they do not experience these Christian material forms as artworks or heritage, but as sacred things that were mistreated and even desecrated in the process of being reframed as art and heritage. These sensibilities indicate that the process of heritagizing religion is not as smooth a transition from a religious to a secular regime as one might think. As pointed out by Crispin Payne, religious objects in museums are not easily subsumed fully under a secular regime. Museums in the United Kingdom, he reports, have opened up possibilities to engage in devotional viewing on the part of those visitors for whom the objects are part of their living faith. The question how to deal with such objects regarding preservation, display, and the ways in which visitors are invited to engage with them is a matter debated hotly in heritage and museum circles. The urgency to address this issue is enhanced by the increasing religious plurality of European societies due to migration, through which the displays and depots hosting religious things assembled under imperialism have very much come under scrutiny. Many people with roots in the former colonies are now standing face to face with items from their religious world on display in a museum, calling to unpack and face the history of European imperialism and colonialism and their countries of origin. By the same token, we note a strong investment in Christianity as a culturalized resource for an exclusive European identity. So at this moment, there is a strong engagement from multiple positions with things from the past, and as scholars, of course, we must go and look along, if only to help open up new futures. Colonial collections contain many things from the sphere of outreach of European imperialism, waiting to be unpacked, sometimes literally, but certainly semantically, scrutinized, and to some extent also repatriated. The Überseemuseum Bremen hosts a collection of Legba figures and Jokawo, could be translated as charms, that were assembled by missionaries of the Norddeutsche Missionsgesellschaft during their activities among the Ewe in the late 19th and early 20th century in the German colony Togo, and in particular by Karl Spies, a missionary who also wrote a diary about the collection he set up and sent to the museum in Bremen. And these objects which he sent, here you see a whole list of Erläuterungen, were also analyzed in publications, of course, by the then director, Schurz, the then director of the museum in Bremen, but also by the missionary Spies himself. The objects were gathered in the aftermath of Ewe converting to Christianity, for converts were expected to destroy their heathen objects, and some then were saved from the iconoclastic fire and taken to the museum in Bremen. They did not have any religious use any longer and became some sort of sacred waste. For more than 100 years, the objects have been kept in the museum's depot, with some on display, you see that here, in the so-called Schaumagazin. I approach these things as religious matters that enshrine colonial and post-colonial entanglements of people, objects, and ideas in Africa and Europe. And as part of collections assembled in colonial times and now kept in the museum, they are also pressing matter, as Wayne Modest puts it, and a disturbing heritage that calls for being scrutinized. At present, I'm engaged in a collaborative project led by Wayne Modest that unpacks colonial collections. The title of the project is Pressing Matter, Ownership, Value, and the Question of Colonial Heritage in Museums. And the focus of the project I'm doing, together with Peter Pels, focuses on this kind of waste that is produced through conversion. The idea is to track and unpack these entanglements by following their stations, the stations of their trajectory step by step from their original origin and use among the Ewe in what is now southern Togo and southeastern Ghana, to their being put at rest in the depot, so as to reconstruct the transformations of the value and meaning of these objects in the course of their trajectory. Having just started the collaborative research, which also involves scholars from Ghana, I started to realize that the Legba figures and the Jokawo, the charms, should still be seen as in-between objects, not only in the sense that they mediated between humans and spirits, but also in between the categories of religious objects, ethnographica, heritage. Indeed, still sacred waste, perhaps lost in translation between the categories. During my last visit to Ghana in January 2020, just before the pandemic immobilized all of us, I spoke to contemporary Ewe priest Christopher Vonkujovi and showed him some photographs of these figures and objects in the depot. And he has similar Legba figures in his own shrine. You see that here. We discussed all the pictures I had with me of Legba in the collection, as well as the joka described by Spies. For him, the items were not mere objects that had moved through a long trajectory in which they passed from being religious objects that harbor spirit power to mere dead museum objects. The Legba figures for him were likely to be alive and hungry, eagerly awaiting to be called by a priest and fed. While he would love to open up a space for the Legbao to come home to Ghana, he told me that he was aware that for many Ghanaians, these figures would not at all qualify as heritage to be recaptured. They were still regarded as powerful idols devoted to evil spirits that have rightly been turned into waste and that should rather have been burned. From the perspective of many Christians, more than 70% of Ghana's population registers as Christian, such objects do not even deserve to be kept in a museum, as they may still harbor indigenous spirits. While Vonkujovi appreciates their presence, they fear it. It is the presence of demons or even the devil himself. For both positions, the Legba figures and charms are in between things that are not neutralized by the secular frame of the museum in which they have been kept for 100 years. For Vonkujovi, these things may be embraced as living religious heritage, while Pentecostals would rather discard them as filthy, even though for them they retain spiritual power. It would lead too far here to explore this case in more detail, and I think it would resonate in many ways with the case presented by Adeline just prior to this lecture. The point I want to make is that in the transition from the regime of religion to that of heritage, things do not necessarily lose their cult value in favor of a new secular exhibition value, certainly not as the societies in which such things are kept become increasingly pluralized and painfully aware of their contested colonial past. This means that the secular frame which shapes heritage as a regime, or has long been shaping heritage as a regime, is disturbed. I hope to have been able to show that it is fruitful to probe into heritage from the angle of dissonant things that have fallen out of religion as lived. As matter out of time and place, such things are nodes to trace unexpected lines between past and present and to spotlight unexpected entanglements of waste, heritage, and religion, and the material coexistence of different temporalities. The category of religious heritage, into which both instances of sacred waste presented here fall, appears to be an intriguing hybrid. While heritage is framed as secular, it contains things from the religious domain that still carry along their previous religious or cult value, for better or worse, depending on the beholder. This containment, through which the original religious use of things that became waste and were subsequently heritagized is still present, suggests that secularization is not a linear, but rather, as Sigrid Weigel also argues with regard to images, rather a dialectical process, always haunted by the prior religious uses of the things that it includes by virtue of marking the boundary that separates heritage from religion and waste. Religious heritage remains indebted to the religious dimension of the things that are heritagized. The noun heritage is haunted by the attribute religious, which cannot be fully contained, but serves as a reminder of the real religion from which the heritagized religious things originate. This opens up, of course, for the possibility of reversibility, as the example of desecrated churches in post-socialist Eastern Europe that are in the process of being reconsecrated, or that of the Hagia Sophia that has just been turned from museum to mosque, show plastically. Studying religious heritage exposes the indebtedness of the secular to the religious in past and present, and holds open all sorts of possible futures. So what we call religious heritage enshrines a complex entanglement of religion, waste, and heritage that can play out in multiple ways. While a likely future for Christianity in Europe may lie in its being recast as heritage, the things in colonial collections on display in exhibitions or kept in depots may call for being reanimated and brought back into a religious regime, or they remain in between. In all these investigations, the pursuit of the question, what is religious heritage and what is religious element of religion, waste, and heritage. The focus on disturbing things that owe their accommodation into the frame of heritage to their becoming religious waste offers a material ground for disturbing heritage in a political and epistemological sense that may have repercussions for politics of identity and belonging in our entangled world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Birgit. So I think I'd start by, again, the selfish way of saying what I took away from this, but I think it's more of a memory that talk triggered, just the way Anne's keynote made me think that I can never see the beans in Germany the way I used to see them anymore. Here, Birgit's talk reminded me of conversations in Ethiopia among our mothers and our grandmothers about having to throw away their ritual objects such as beads and clothes that are special clothes that are worn during certain rituals. They had to be thrown away, into the water actually, so they can never be found when people are converted. So I was thinking, would they ever be regarded as sacred waste, or as a heritages, or as I just simply reduced to being nothing, to insignificance? And so I was reflecting on this as Birgit was speaking. Thank you again for provoking these thoughts. Thank you both, Anne and Birgit. Having said that, we have some 15 minutes for conversations. If there are pressing questions or provocations, suggestions, whatever it is that you have to share, the floor is now open to those. And yeah. In the meantime, okay, Jeremy, then go ahead.
I'll jump right in also because childcare duties will take me away soon as well. Thank you so much, Birgit, for this wide-ranging and not disturbing but provocative keynote. This is probably more in the order of a comment than a question, but I'll try to frame it as a question, a la the American game show Jeopardy. I found myself thinking back to a lot of the anthropological work on fetishism that I'm sure you're quite familiar with as you spoke, and some of those works were probably latent interlocutors for you. So particularly William Pietz's work on the genealogy of the fetish, and this argument that this sort of in-between object-subject is itself an expression of the catastrophic political economy of the slave trade in West Africa, right? If I'm hopefully paraphrasing his argument effectively. And I guess this is really more of a question to all of us than to you, Birgit, but since you have done us the honor of closing the conference, I'll place it to you. I guess in that spirit, what would be the sort of political economic conditions of possibility for the sort of in-betweenness subject objects of religious heritage that we're so familiar with now? And I guess in one way, this is an invitation to think through the genealogy of the fetish vis-a-vis heritage, but in another, it's just a sort of intervention that came to mind.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, Pietz is always on my mind, but also, of course, the more recent translation of the Bros by Rosalind Shaw and so on. And I have been thinking about the fetish for very long. I also approached the fetish from the angle of idolatry. I think that Hartmut Böhm has a point in emphasizing also the religious roots, in a way, of the anti-Catholicism that goes into the notion of the fetish, with the West African coast also becoming a site where Protestants and Catholics fight each other over the value and status assigned to things. So this is very much, of course, at the back of my mind. We are just starting to develop this project to unpack by really looking at the stuff that is in the depot. And we do this in a collaboration with also scholars from Ghana. Now, one thing that strikes me very much, and that I found less about in the literature on the fetish, is this insistence by Christopher von Kujovi that they are hungry. I realized in my conversations with him that somehow I have always thought about the fetish as a thing of thoughts, but not realized the extent to which it is really not that. That indeed, I think Adeline also referred to Ingold and this moment prior, in a way, to a split between the material and the spiritual. So it's alive and it is hungry. And I realized the extent to which these so-called fetishes are at the center of what, perhaps with Feuerbach one could call a Stoffwechsel, a kind of metabolism on which the continuation of life begins. It is a question of feeding and being fed. And I'm now thinking a lot about that dimension, which I hope to contribute in a way also to the debates around the fetish, which focused very much also on questions of categories and concepts. But I think that the eating focus may also open up perhaps to a deeper understanding of how these remnants, of course, of colonial missions and so on, now kept in a museum, are still alive in that they are hungry, they want to eat, and they consist of all the food they have received prior to being taken there. Anyhow, so that's a direction into which I want to take also this work on the fetish as this kind of scary presence in a museum where it will not even have that name any longer, right?
Okay, we have on the list Marianne, Regina, and Karsten. What I suggest is all three of you ask your questions in aggregate, and then Birgit speaks back to the questions. So Marianne, go ahead, and then Regina, and then Karsten.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for a very interesting lecture, from which I especially take the really useful comparison between the ways in which in a particular historical period in Ghana things were, as you described, in the context of mission, in the context of colonialism, things moved or taken out of the original historical religious context and were turned into heritage, and Europe in a particular moment in its history the other way around. I think this kind of focus on transregional connections and a diachronic comparison in the best sense, right? To really compare different historical periods in different contexts is very helpful. And I think, I just wonder whether you think that this could even be broadened to include other examples, historical and geographical examples. The other thing I found very thought-provoking was, again, that juxtaposition of heritage and religion as two regimes of creating value, of bestowing value upon certain things, and then to look at the ways in which they move from one domain to the other. And I thought it's interesting to see, of course, how the fields in which objects are sort of acquiring a value sort of multiply. So I have this one case which I have explored in Quebec, where there is an object in the parliament, in the parliament of Quebec itself, which is a large crucifix, which is situated above the speaker of the parliament, which became hotly contested and in fact was made subject of a parliamentary decision just a day after the Bouchard and Charles Taylor recommended its removal. The parliament voted in favor of keeping it, although this is a population which is now sort of strongly secularized. So where we see how it's not only about heritage, but things get politicized. In the same way, we can look at art as another field in which these objects acquire new meaning. So in the same way, we can think about politicization of particular objects. We can talk about the artification of certain objects, the ways in which, for example, that very crucifix was sort of made subject to the assessment of certain art historians, according which adjudicated its art historical value and so on. So what I find, or what it's just to say, what I found inspiring is in fact what you called the regime of value production, actually. And this is something I just take from your lecture, and perhaps yeah, whether the question would be, is that the main, let's say, the main social logic of heritage, actually, the production of value?
Yeah. Should I answer now, or the chair?
No, I thought we would just collect 2 more questions. Yeah, Regina and Carsten.
Yeah. All right, I chime into the same direction, I think, as Marianne Burkhardt did, but I would also like to emphasize that the religious doesn't necessarily get lost in the heritage project process. So this in-betweenness, I think, is very important, because one of the first categories in World Heritage was huge religious buildings. I mean, churches, domes, mosques, what have you, were among the first World Heritage sites in the material domain, which didn't mean that they lost their religious function, but they had, as Marianne also just said, the art historical, the architectural historical component was added to it. So you had, in a sense, heritage need not be secular in the least. But what I think is interesting to pursue is at what moment is it possible to move something religious also into the heritage or into that other value category. And I very much believe it is all a matter of value generation. I think you need heterogeneous societies with a more or less democratic base in order to facilitate this moving different kinds of stuffs into heritage categories, because otherwise you are going to confront the blasphemous problematic, which one has seen with the destruction of some heritage sites that were considered, it was considered blasphemous to a more recent religion to honor an older religious formation. So I think with these with this ambivalence of is it still potent, is it not still potent, you need to have a relatively accepting heterogeneous populace that can handle this in some form or another, that this multiple category association with objects, which is of course the case in a missionarized society, because you have several layers of religion present. Thank you very much. It was really stimulating.
So it's my turn. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, to the organizers. I'm joining you from Heidelberg, where we're also very interested in heritage at the moment. And it's really exciting, and it's great that such an event is happening and I can listen in and get really inspiring input. My question is in a similar direction to what has been asked about regimes of value, I guess in this Epicurean also sense, where you have the competition between different regimes of value. But more concretely, I was very intrigued by these repurposing of buildings and the built environment and churches in Utrecht in particular, and whether it is actually true that the ownership changes or whether the ownership actually stays with the church, so that it's just a matter of how you make more money out of it. Instead of holding masses, you have the masses come to dance or, I don't know, sell whatever they want to sell. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I say something now? Yeah, but let me start with the letter. This is very interesting. Well, 1 out of 4 churches has lost its function, and that means that the ownership changes. The reason is often that the congregations are not able to maintain the church, and often the diocese also says we are not able to maintain all this. And that is why I think in the Netherlands at this moment there is a quite sharp difference between a religious and a secular regime in maintaining and keeping up these kinds of buildings. And so the buildings really switch in a way from the authority of the Protestant or Catholic Church under the authority of state institutions or of municipalities. And then it means that totally different rules apply. This means, in particular, if a Catholic church is being deconsecrated, it means that the stuff, the materials have to be taken out. Dan Bakers wrote a wonderful article, or several articles about that, what it means. Certain sacred objects have to be destroyed because they are simply of such an ecclesiological value that they are not up for grabs in any secular setting. That is the big horror still of the Catholic Church, to have all these things, the Sacred Heart of Jesus in pubs and so on, to have churches turned into eating places which still contain some of the original sacred elements. So there is quite a discussion. And for that reason, also, I may have emphasized in a way the implications of the shift from a whole building or an object from the sphere of the religious into the secular. This is a very, very strong shift. And people look at that. And the interesting thing is that many people who have no more any interest in living as Christians are very much concerned about these buildings. They want these buildings to be kept in a worthy manner. They are not so happy if a church becomes a supermarket like Jumbo we just had recently. And there is a whole big debate about this that is going on and on and on around these issues. And that is what I'm following at this moment. That also makes why I think I extrapolated in a way the difference between a heritage regime that operates in another logic than a religious regime. This is of course not to say, Regina, that I would say that heritage and religion do not also belong together. I think that in fact even the religious regimes offer ways of keeping things, of taking care of things, think of relics and so on, that of course have also played into the ways in which heritage is being conserved. And there are lots of churches, one only need to visit Rome, for example, to see that of course churches are also opened up to display in a way all kinds of artworks as heritage items. What one does see, however, if one visits a church in Rome, that there are always these signboards that say, this is a holy space. You can't enter in your bikini or whatever, and don't take pictures. And many, many churches are closed for tourists during Mass and so on. So there's a very careful negotiation of the two regimes, which are in fact accommodated into the church building on the part of the church authority, something I find incredibly interesting. This is indeed not to say that religion and heritage are incompatible, but it's very, very interesting to look very specifically how the same building may host a kind of two regimes that fold into each other, but that potentially also conflict each other. And that is something I find very, very interesting to look at, and that what I wanted to show here. And yes, Marianne, I think that things get incredibly politicized. So the heritageization of Christianity is a highly politicized issue. It is part, in a way, of this whole attempt to define, in retrospect, identity of Europe that is identitarian and potentially closing. Many of those who have lost the church as religious peoples accommodate refugees and are not happy about the use of Christianity and its items in profiling a supposed Judeo-Christian heritage. So this is incredibly politicized. That is also what I wanted to point out in this lecture. Whereas on the other hand, also, we are post-colonial plural societies. Also the colonial past is heavily politicized, how to deal with this. And I think by bringing, in a way, different types of sacred waste, if we can call it like that, or religious heritage in conversation with each other, we can indeed start to unpack the larger societal issues that are debated via these issues of what to heritageize, so what to value and what to keep, but also how heritage poses all kinds of challenges, especially to face the colonial past. And that is what I hope one would go into more. I have never been at the center of heritage studies, but always come into it from the side, because it was on my way in my work with things. But what I do notice is that there is still, at least in the Dutch setting, I would say, some kind of rift between people who are interested in the abandonment of churches and what happens to Christianity. And I would say, well, Christianity has a great future as heritage in the Netherlands. And then people who work on the museums and colonial heritage, the colonial past, all these specters, the skeletons in the closets and so on. These are still quite separate. And I think it's important to bring that together from the idea of entanglement, which indeed then also means an understanding of transregional connections. We can't understand any European heritage and what we are if we somehow blend out colonialism as dealing with other kinds of museum, other kinds of people and so on. That was also my concern here. So I think that indeed coloniality, all these colonial collections and the process of unchurching and the keeping of Christianity under the frame of heritage, it belongs together. Yeah, and that's what, in a way, we try to analyze in this religious matters in an entangled world project. I don't know, I could not answer everything, I think, but thanks in any case. These are great comments, and it would be nice to go on and on. And I also see some questions in the chat, which I could not even...
I was going to bring that to your attention. We are already past our time limit, but if you could give a really, really short answer. I don't think, Patrick, your question is not a question, it's questions. So yeah, you can decide if you could give like a brief answers in 2 to 3 minutes, and that would be good.
Okay, so let me look closely at Anne's point. Yeah, indeed. So Anne wonders how I think about their power, whether hunger or their pollution can both be tapped into and accessed, manipulated, or whether you see also a possibility for object in action in a way that they shapeshift the regimes that struggle to continue. Yes, of course. I think so. By doing this kind of study, I think these are disturbing forms of heritage that, if scrutinized, will allow us to disturb heritage conceptually and politically. That's exactly what I think and what my interest would be here. That's also why I opted for this double title. There is disturbing heritage, but I think we also want to disturb what is taken as heritage. And I think this study disturbs in a way how we as scholars and people in society take what heritage is. I think heritage is a minefield. It's incredibly disturbing and not consoling and nice and everything, but it's really something else. That's why I was so happy when I heard that you organize Heritage Out of Control workshop. This is exactly it. So thank you for Anne for asking about this. And I see a link here with regard to your wonderful keynote 2 days ago. And then I see Patrick. Yeah, the mediatic processes in these circulations. Yeah, I agree with that. And I could not now unpack all this, but there is already, in fact, a problem, Patrick, in that the so-called fetishes, the leg bar and the charms that are in the museum cannot travel back as objects. I was a bit naive, so I asked the people in the museum, can't we take some of those back? But this is really not possible for the sake of research. What one can take big up pictures. And you saw, I had this kind of pictures, which I could show to the priest, perhaps a 3D print, but not the thing itself. And so the process, in a way, of the mediations through which these things are approached, also how they figure as specimen in these very interesting articles about which I showed you something, or the ways in which they are represented in Spies' diary as drawings made by himself. All this will go into this analysis, for I believe it's really necessary to do a very, very careful kind of reconstruction of this trajectory, which will always have to include the way in which they are mediated graphically, but also through what kinds of concepts. Yeah, so I thank you for that. And indeed, this whole idea of the things being so hungry, I think made me very much alert to the facts that the things change, they are mediated in all kinds of ways, and yet they can also be claimed to be just stuck in there and return us to what they have been, perhaps objects in the midst of a whole cosmology around the metabolistic way of being in the world, perhaps. Yeah, anyhow, so that's a big question. I still have to think about the question of sounds here as well. Yeah. For I know that spirits in the Ghanaian setting, of course, they speak, you can hear them. They have this eerie sound, as I heard, but I have never heard them. So there's a lot there. Thank you for pointing that out. And I think even your work on atmosphere, Patrick, will be important in this tracing of the trajectory. Yeah. So thanks. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Birgit, and thank you very much, everyone. I don't think I can ever do justice if I try to wrap everything up. So I'll just leave that aside for now. But I think what could be said and what I think could represent the conversations the three of us had and continue having is that the realization that we are not actually thinking about these things alone, that there's a lot of people out there thinking along the same lines of disturbing heritage, of thinking about waste in relation to other non-human beings and actors. I think that's a wonderful thing to know. And then coming to the last 3 days, I think the way that, so initially when we received the abstracts, we didn't know how to aggregate them, how to do justice in bringing, abstracts together, like thematically or something. But what became clear to us in the course of the last 3 days is that actually there is so many overlapping ideas, themes, theoretical, methodological connections, even between what seem to be worlds apart. I couldn't have imagined that Annika's work could speak to mine, but it actually does in so many different ways and in very, very productive ways. And I think that's one big realization for us, apart from indeed the so many insights we have gained from having this conversation with you. And I don't know why I have to be the one to do this. And if, like Annika and Zizek have completely abandoned me, and this is not the best thing to do. But I think you understand the nervousness here, because it's a huge responsibility to kind of say goodbye okay, I think I don't have to say goodbye. There is no need for saying goodbye now. I think this conversation has to continue, and it's a beginning of something really, really important, of thinking together about things that matter to all of us here. And in that spirit, I'd like to invite you for like 10 to 15 minutes of conversation as to where we would like to take this conversation. Is it another conference, a bigger one we want to organize together, or think about publication and whatever it is? Those of you who have time, I'd like you to join us, kind of figure some preliminary thoughts out, and then we can continue the rest of the conversation via email and everything else that's available to us to communicate